He gardened. He had grandchildren. He worked at a supermarket distribution center for 27 years and retired without incident. His neighbor walked past his house so often that the house became invisible to her, just another well-kept property on a street full of well-kept properties. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. And for 40 years, he was the most hunted and most anonymous man in California history. Between 1974 and 1986, he raped over 50 people, murdered 13, and broke into more than 100 homes across 11 counties. He called his victims afterward, sometimes for years, to remind them he was still there. He sent poems to newspapers. He called a police hotline and told investigators, on tape, that he had already chosen his next victim and they would never catch him. He was right. For a very long time. This is not a story about how he almost got away. This is a story about the gardener, the retiree, the grandpa with a roast in the oven, and how 40 years of silence finally ran out. Not because he made a mistake. Because science caught up to him in a way he never imagined possible. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. California in the mid-1970s was a particular kind of place. Sacramento's eastern suburbs, Rancho Cordova, Carmichael, Citrus Heights, were not glamorous. They were tract housing communities built on post-war optimism, cul-de-sacs, modest yards, families who knew each other's cars. State workers, teachers, military families. The kind of neighborhoods where people left doors unlocked not because they were careless but because nothing had ever happened to suggest they shouldn't. The national mood in 1976 was anxious. Watergate had just happened, Vietnam had ended badly, the economy was struggling. But that anxiety was political, distant. It wasn't the kind of fear that followed you into your bedroom. So when a man began moving through those quiet residential streets at night, peering into windows, memorizing routines, noting when husbands left for work, nobody saw him. He was a shape at the edge of the ordinary. And by the time these communities understood what was happening, he had already been watching for months. Joseph James DeAngelo was not an obvious monster. He was born in 1945 in Bath, New York, one of 4 siblings. His family moved to California. He graduated high school in Folsom in 1964, joined the Navy, served 22 months on a cruiser and a destroyer tender during the Vietnam era, and came home with a sense of discipline and, by all accounts, a desire to be in law enforcement. He studied police science at Sierra College, then criminal justice at Sacramento State. He interned at the Roseville Police Department. In 1973, the local Exeter newspaper ran a profile on him. The headline read, "Navy veteran serves Exeter as policeman." The article quoted him directly. He said law enforcement was his career, and his job was serving the community. He meant it, in whatever way a person like him can mean anything. He worked the Exeter beat from 1973 to 1976. He was promoted to sergeant. He ran a program called the Joint Attack on Burglary, a neighborhood crime prevention initiative. He stood in front of homeowners and told them how to protect themselves. In 1975, while still a working police officer in Exeter, he shot and killed a professor named Claude Snelling outside Snelling's own home, in front of Snelling's daughter, while attempting to take the girl from the property. He drove back to his shift. No one connected it to him. In 1976, he moved to Auburn as a police officer and began what investigators would later call the East Area Rapist Attacks, targeting women alone, or couples asleep, in Sacramento's eastern neighborhoods. He had a method. He would enter a home beforehand, sometimes days before, to move things around, unlock windows, learn the layout. Then he would return. He was organized in a way that reflected training. In 1979, he was caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a store. He was fired from the Auburn Police Department. At the time, no one thought to connect a shoplifting cop to a serial attacker. He went home. He got a job at a Save Mart distribution center in Roseville and worked there quietly for nearly 3 decades. The crimes he committed between 1976 and 1986 fall into phases that investigators at the time treated as entirely separate. In Sacramento's eastern neighborhoods, the man they called the East Area Rapist was attacking women and couples in their homes at night, masked, armed, and methodical. He bound victims. He spoke in a low, controlled voice. He took small things from houses, coins, jewelry, items with almost no monetary value. He called victims afterward. Some women received calls from him for 25 years. In 1978, a couple named Katie and Brian Majori were walking their dog in Rancho Cordova in the evening. He shot them both dead in the street. Not in a home. Not during a burglary. Just a couple walking a dog. Something had shifted. By 1979, he had moved south. Santa Barbara, Goleta, Irvine, Ventura. He was now killing couples in their homes and leaving no witnesses. Southern California investigators called this person the original Night Stalker. They didn't know about Sacramento. Sacramento didn't know about them. Different counties, different filing systems, different investigators, the same man moving between them like weather. His last confirmed attack was in 1986. An 18-year-old named Janelle Cruz. After that, he went back to Citrus Heights and never attacked anyone again. Just stopped. Went to work. Came home. Gardened. The investigation, or rather, investigations, ran for years across departments that sometimes didn't speak to each other. Every reasonable technique was tried. Composite sketches. Tip lines. Blood typing, which in the 1970s and early 1980s was the best available biological evidence tool. Community reward funds that eventually reached significant sums. Neighborhood canvases. Handwriting analysis on the letters he sent. An FBI national publicity campaign in 2016, nearly 40 years after the first attack. CODIS, the National DNA Database, should have been the answer when DNA technology became available in the late 1980s. It wasn't. CODIS requires a match. It compares crime scene DNA to DNA profiles of people who have already been convicted of serious offenses. DeAngelo had no felony convictions. His only recorded arrest was that shoplifting incident in 1979, which resulted in dismissal and no DNA collection. CODIS found nothing because CODIS had nothing to find him against. Some departments destroyed biological evidence when statutes of limitations expired, standard practice, not negligence, but the effect was the same. Evidence that might have solved the case was gone. The investigators who preserved their DNA samples held on to something they couldn't yet use. There were wrong turns. There were moments when investigators were certain they had their man. They didn't. The years went on. What the years look like in real life is this. In 1986, when the attacks stopped, the victims ranged in age from their early 20s to their 40s. Some were just beginning careers. Some had young children. The attacks had interrupted their lives in ways that don't repair cleanly or fully. Those victims aged. Some married, some divorced, some raised families, some struggled to. Some spent decades on the edges of recovery. Jane Carson Sandler had been assaulted in 1976 with her 3-year-old son in the room. She was still thinking about it every single day 44 years later. Meanwhile, DeAngelo collected a pension. He babysat grandchildren. He lived on a street where neighbors waved. His former boss at the Auburn Police Department, looking back years later, called him an average cop. The Auburn Journal had run a photo of him at a Babe Ruth baseball fundraiser during the same period he was attacking people. He was in the picture, smiling, in uniform. The contrast is not a detail. It is the story. A man is capable of holding two entirely separate lives, and the ordinary one makes the other invisible. By 2011, the case had developed an unusual second life on the internet. Cold case message boards had formed around the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker, what enthusiasts called errands. Amateur investigators, retired cops, writers, people who simply could not let it go. One of them was a crime writer named Michelle McNamara. McNamara was the wife of comedian Patton Oswalt. She had an obsessive interest in unsolved murders and a writer's ability to find the human shape in a cold case file. She connected with a detective named Paul Holes, a Contra Costa County forensic investigator who had worked the case professionally for years, and the two shared information across jurisdictions in a way the original investigations never could. McNamara is the person who gave the case its most lasting name. She called him the Golden State Killer. The name caught. It brought public attention the case had never quite had before. On April 21, 2016, Michelle McNamara died in her sleep. She was 46. Her book on the Golden State Killer was unfinished. Her husband completed it with the help of Holes and journalist Bill Jensen. The book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was published on February 27, 2018. The phrase in the title came from something DeAngelo had whispered to a 15-year-old victim in 1976. He had told her, "You'll be silent forever, and I'll be gone in the dark." The book came out. 2 months later, he was arrested. The breakthrough came not from a new witness or a deathbed confession but from a retired patent attorney with a biology PhD and a genealogy database. Paul Holes, who had spent more time thinking about this case than almost any living person, made a decision in March 2017. DNA technology had advanced to the point where it was possible to upload a crime scene profile to a public genealogy database and search for partial matches, not the suspect himself, but relatives who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA for ancestry research. Holes contacted a researcher named Barbara Raventer. She was not a law enforcement officer. She was a genealogist who had worked in patent law and had a background in biology. She had never worked a murder case. Holes asked her to try something that had never been done before in a case of this scale. The DNA they used came from preserved evidence collected at a 1980 double murder scene. Semen, held in evidence for nearly 40 years, still viable for analysis. Raventer uploaded the profile to GeneMatch, a public database where people voluntarily share their DNA for genealogy research. GeneMatch doesn't contain criminals. It contains grandmothers tracing their Irish ancestry, adoptees looking for biological parents, cousins comparing results from 23andMe. It is not a law enforcement database. That's exactly what made it useful. The upload produced matches. Not to DeAngelo. He wasn't in there. To distant relatives. Third cousins. People who shared a common ancestor with the killer without knowing it, without knowing what their DNA would help find. From those distant matches, Raventer's team began constructing a family tree. Not a small one. A tree spanning generations, traced through census records, obituaries, birth certificates, local newspaper archives, and public records. They were working backwards from a cluster of third cousins toward a pair of common ancestors, DeAngelo's great-great-great-grandparents, and then forward again through every branch, eliminating anyone who was too young, too old, the wrong gender, or in the wrong geography. The process took roughly a year. When the branches narrowed, 2 names remained. One was eliminated. The other was Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., 72 years old, retired, living in Citrus Heights, Sacramento. Investigators placed him under surveillance. They did not approach him. They waited. He discarded a tissue. They retrieved it. They ran his DNA against the crime scene profile. The match was confirmed. The probability that someone other than DeAngelo had left that evidence at those crime scenes was, for practical purposes, 0. Sacramento District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert said afterward, "The past met the present that day." DNA became the voice of the victims. On April 24, 2018, a fugitive apprehension team watched DeAngelo's house in Citrus Heights. He walked out of his front door. He was wearing a t-shirt, cargo shorts, and tube socks. When officers moved in, he didn't fight. He looked confused. His first words, according to those present, were, "I have a roast in the oven." Officers told him they'd take care of it. He was handcuffed and placed in a vehicle. The man who had taunted investigators for decades, who had called victims and whispered threats, who had written poems and sent them to newspapers, that man said nothing in the interrogation room. He sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights for nearly 2 hours and stared at the walls. He apparently worried, At one point, about leaving DNA on a can of soda offered by detectives, not understanding they had already confirmed the match from his trash. He was charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder. On June 29, 2020, he pleaded guilty. He also admitted to 161 uncharged crimes, rapes, kidnappings, assaults, related to dozens of additional victims. The plea spared him a death penalty trial. Some prosecutors objected. Orange County DA Todd Spitzer said in court, plainly, that he believed DeAngelo deserved death. But he also said they had met with the victims. They knew the age of the case. They understood what a years-long trial would cost the people who had already given enough. The sentencing hearing lasted 3 days. Survivor after survivor stood and spoke directly to a man who sat in a wheelchair, head down, face masked. Some were now in their 60s and 70s. Some had lived more than half their lives with what he had done to them. Jane Carson Sandler spoke of 44 years. Pete Schultz described being tied to a bedpost with his hands turning blue while his mother was assaulted in the next room. He had been a child. He was now an adult man standing in a courtroom telling the story for the first time in public. One survivor said to DeAngelo directly, "Your secrets have been exposed. Your double life is over. The entire world knows who you are and what you did. You will forever be known as a repulsive coward who hid behind a mask." After 3 days, DeAngelo stood up. He removed his face covering. He said 26 words. "I've listened to all your statements. Each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt. Thank you, Your Honor." 26 words. Judge Michael Bowman addressed the survivors directly before sentencing, saying he had been moved by their grace, qualities, he said, turning toward DeAngelo, that the defendant clearly lacked. DeAngelo was sentenced to 13 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 8 additional years. He is currently held at California State Prison, Corcoran. This case changed forensic investigation in ways that are still being measured. DeAngelo was the first person publicly arrested through genetic genealogy. Since his arrest in 2018, at least 400 cold cases have been reopened using the same method. Parabon Nanolabs, working with GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA, has built a forensic genealogy practice that operates across jurisdictions. C.C. Moore, one of the most prominent forensic genealogists at Parabon, has said of the technique, "We found a way to make the dead speak." GeneMatch changed its privacy policies after the arrest. Users now have to explicitly opt into allowing law enforcement searches, rather than being included by default. The ethical debate about genetic privacy and public safety databases continues. Both sides have points. But for the family members who sat in that courtroom, for the survivors who had spent 4 decades waiting, for Michelle McNamara, who died without seeing it but whose work helped make it possible, the method worked. He told a 15-year-old girl he would be gone in the dark. He was wrong about that too. A few things worth carrying out of this story. Your routine is not private in the way you think it is. DeAngelo selected victims partly by learning their schedules, when they left for work, when they came home, when they were alone. Be thoughtful about who can observe that pattern and how consistently you run it. Biological evidence is irreplaceable. Several departments destroyed evidence in this case because it was standard practice. Advocates push for changes to how evidence is stored. If you ever find yourself involved in a legal situation where physical evidence exists, as a victim, a witness, or a family member, understand that it may matter in ways that aren't visible yet. The wrong name can ruin someone. Investigations in cases this high-profile sometimes fixated on particular individuals. An innocent person's life can be damaged by association with a case they had nothing to do with. The genetic genealogy method, when done carefully, builds toward confirmation rather than assumption. That matters. And if something doesn't feel right, a car that appears too often on your block, a neighbor's behavior that registers as strange, trust the instinct enough to say it out loud. DeAngelo stalked neighborhoods openly for months. Some residents noticed unfamiliar presences. Very few said anything because nothing had happened yet. Something about this case will stay with me, and probably with you. Not the crimes, though those are hard to forget. What stays is the image of a man gardening in Citrus Heights while the people he hurt were aging in quiet damage 3 neighborhoods away. The ordinary life runs parallel to the devastation it caused, with no acknowledgement, no weight, no consequence. That's the part that haunts me. And then a retired patent attorney sitting with a genealogy database and a 40-year-old DNA sample, building a family tree one census record at a time, until only one name was left. Justice is rarely cinematic. Sometimes it's a discarded tissue in a trash can and a database full of people trying to find their great-great-grandparents. If this story mattered to you, share it. These cases don't stay alive on their own. The families and survivors of cases like this one deserve to know their stories are still being told. We'll see you in the next one.